History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 9 Worlds Apart. Africa and the Americas moved towards civilization to rhythms very different from those operating elsewhere. Of course, this was not quite so true of Africa as of the Americas, which were cut off by the oceans from all but the fleeting contacts with other continents. The Africans, by contrast, lived in a continent much of which was gradually Islamicized and for a long time had at least peripheral encounters with the first Arab and then the European traders. These were of growing importance as time went by, though they did not suck Africa completely into the mainstream of world history until the late 19th century. This isolation, combined with an almost complete dependence for much of the story on archaeological evidence, makes much African and American history an obscure business. African history, before the coming of European trade and exploration, is largely a matter of an internal dynamic. We can barely discern, but we may presume folk movements to have played a large part in it. There are many legends of migration, and they always speak of movement from the north to the south and west. In each case, scholars have to evaluate the legend in its context. And with the help from reference in Egyptian records, travelers' tales, and archaeological discovery. But the general tendency is striking. It seems to register a general trend, the enrichment and elaboration of African culture in the north first, and its appearance in the south only much later. The kingdom of Kush, whose connections with Egypt have been noted, is a convenient beginning. By the 5th century BC, the Kushites had lost control of Egypt and retreated once more to Meroe, their capital in the south. But they had centuries of flourishing culture still ahead of them. From Egypt, probably they had brought with them a hieroglyph. Claims are now being made to have deciphered it. Certainly, they diffused their knowledge to the south and west in the Sudan, where notable metallurgical skills were later to flourish among the Nubians and the Sudanese. In the last few centuries BC, ironworking appears south of the Sahara in central Nigeria. Its importance was recognized by its remaining the closely guarded secret of kings, but so valuable a skill slowly traveled southwards. By about the 12th century AD, it had penetrated the southeast, and the Pygmies and the Bushmen of the south were the only Africans then still living in the Stone Age. Probably the greatest difference made by the spread of ironworking was to the agriculture. It made possible a new penetration of the forests and better tilling of the soil, which may be connected with the arrival of new food crops from Asia in the early Christian era, and so led to new folk movements and population growth. Hunting and gathering areas were broken up by the coming of herdsmen and farmers, who can be discerned already by about 500 AD in much of the East and Southeast Africa, in modern Zimbabwe and the Transvaal. Yet, those Africans did not acquire the plough. Possibly the reason lies in the lack in most of the continent south of Egypt of an animal resistant enough to African disease to draw one. One area where there were ploughs was Ethiopia, and there animals could be bred successfully, as the early use of the horse indicates. Horses were also bred for riding in the southern Sahara. This suggests once again the important limiting factor of the African environment. Most of the continent's history is the story of response to influences from the outside. Ironworking and new crops from the Near East, Asia, Indonesia, and the Americas, steam engines and medicine from 19th century Europe. These made it possible gradually to grapple with African nature. Without them, Africa south of the Sahara seems almost inert under the huge pressures exercised upon it by geography, climate, and disease. It remained, with some exceptions, for the most part tied to a shifting agriculture, not achieving an intensive one. This was a positive response to the difficult conditions, but could not sustain more than a slow population growth. Nor did southern Africa arrive at the wheel, so it lagged behind in transport, milling, and pottery. The story was different north of the equator. Much Kushite history waits, in the most literal sense, to be uncovered, for few of the major cities have yet been excavated. It is known that in about 300 AD, Kush was overthrown by Ethiopians. They were not then the unique people they were to become, with kings claiming descent from Solomon, and for centuries the only Christian peoples in Africa outside Egypt. They were converted to Christianity by Copts only later in the 4th century. At that time, they were still in touch with the classical Mediterranean world, but the Islamic invasions of Egypt placed between them and it a barrier which was not breached for centuries, during which the Ethiopians battled for survival against pagan and Muslim, virtually isolated from Rome and Byzantium. And Amharic speaking people, they were the only literate non Islamic African nation. The only other place in Africa where Christianity established itself was in the Roman north. Here, it had been a vigorous, if minority, cult. The violence of its dissensions and the pursuit of the Donatists as heretics probably explain its weakness when the Arab invasions brought it face to face with Islam. Except in Egypt, Christianity was extinguished in Africa of the Arab states. Islam, on the other hand, was and has remained enormously successful in Africa. Born by Arab invasion, it spread in the 11th century right across to Niger and Western Africa. Arab sources therefore provide our main information about non literate African societies which stretched across the Sudan and the Sahara after the passing of Kush. They were often trading communities and may reasonably be thought of as city states. The most famous was Timbuktu, impoverished by the time Europeans finally got there, but in the 15th century, important enough to be the site of what has been described as an Islamic university. Politics and economics are still as closely intertwined in Africa as in any part of the world, and it is not surprising that the early kingdoms of Black Africa should have appeared and prospered at the end of important trade routes where there was wealth to tap. Merchants liked stability. Another African state, the earliest recorded by the Arabs, had a name later taken by a modern nation, Ghana. Its origins are obscure, but may well have lain in the assertion of its supremacy by a people in the late pre Christian era, who had the advantage of iron weapons and horses. However, this may be, the Ghana recorded by Arab chroniclers and geographers is already an important kingdom when it appears in the records in the 8th century AD. At its greatest extent, Ghana spanned an area about 500 miles across the region framed to the south by the upper reaches of the Niger and Senegal and protected to the north by the Sahara. The Arabs spoke of it as the land of gold. The gold came from the upper Senegal and the Ashanti and was passed by Arab traders by trans Saharan routes or through Egypt to the Mediterranean, where it lubricated European trade. In this way, Africa for a time exercised a positive influence on the outside world. The most important other commodities traded across the Sahara were salt and slaves. Ghana collapsed during the 12th and 13th centuries. It eclipse, its eclipse was followed by the preeminence of Mali, a kingdom whose ruler's wealth caused a sensation when in 1307 he made a pilgrimage to Mecca. It too has given a name to a 20th century African state. Mali was even bigger than Ghana, taking in the whole Senegal basin and running about 1,000 miles inland from the coast at the beginning of the 14th century. Its golden age coincided with much more effective exploitation of the bullion trade than had been achieved by the Ghanaians. The Mali ruler is said to have had 10,000 horses in his stables. This empire broke up in dynastic wars in the late 14th century and finally went under after defeat by the Moroccans. Other African states were to follow. But although in some cases the Arab records speak of African courts attended by men of letters, there is no native documentation which enables us to reach these peoples. Clearly, they remained pagan while their rulers belonged to the Islamic world. It may be that the dissolution of Ghana owed something to dissent caused by conversions to Islam. Arab reports make it obvious that the Islamic cult was associated with the ruler in the Sudanese and Saharan states, but had also still to accommodate traditional practice from the pagan past, rather as early Christianity in Europe accepted a similar legacy. Nor did social custom always adapt itself to Islam. Arabic writers expressed shocked disapproval at the public nakedness of Mali girls. Africa, further south of the Sahara, is even harder to get at. At the roots of history, which determined its structures on the eve of its absorption into the world events, was a folk migration of the Negroid people who speak languages of the group called Bantu. This is the term somewhat like Indo European, referring to identifiable linguistic characteristics, not a genetic strain. The detailed course of this movement is, of course, still highly obscure, but its beginnings lie in eastern Nigeria, where there were early Bantu speakers. From there, they took their language and agriculture south, first into the Congo basin. There followed a rapid spread round about the beginning of the Christian era over most of southern Africa. This set the ethnic pattern of modern Africa. Some peoples speaking the language of the Arabs called Swahili, from the Arabic word meaning of the coast, established towns on the East African coasts which were linked to mysterious kingdoms in the interior. This was before the 8th century AD, when the Arabs began to settle in these towns and turn them into ports. The Arabs called the region the land of the Zans, from which was later to come the name of Zanzibar, and said that its peoples prized iron above gold. It is probable that these polities had some kind of trading relations with Asia, even before Arab times. Who the intermediaries were, it is not possible to say, but they may have been Indonesians, such as those who colonized Madagascar. The Africans had gold and iron to offer for luxuries, and they also began the implantation of new crops from Asia, cloves and bananas among them. Even a vague picture of the working of these states is hard to arrive at. Monarchy was by no means the rule in them, and a sense of the importance of the ties of kin seems to have been the only widespread characteristic shared by the black African polities. Organization must have reflected the needs of particular environments and the possibilities presented by particular resources. Yet, kingship was widely diffused. Again, the earliest signs are northern, in Nigeria and Benin. By the 15th century, there were kingdoms in the region of the Great Eastern Lakes, and we hear of the Kingdom of Congo on the lower Congo River. There are not many signs of organization on this scale, and African states were, for a long time, not to produce bureaucratized administration or standing armies. The powers of kings must have been limited not only by custom and respect for tradition, but by the lack of resources to bind men's allegiance beyond the ties imposed by kinship and respect. No doubt, this accounts for the transitory and fleeting nature of many of these states. Ethiopia was an untypical African country. Yet some remarkable traces remain of these dim and shadowy kingdoms. A high level of culture in the East African interior in about the 12th century is demonstrated by the remains of mine workings, roads, rock paintings, canals, and wells. These were the product of a technology which archaeologists have called Azanian. It was the achievement of an advanced Iron Age culture. Agriculture had been practiced in the region since about the beginning of the Christian era. On the basis of that, it was possible to exploit the gold, which was for a long time easily accessible in what is now Zimbabwe. Only simple techniques were needed at first. Large quantities could be obtained by little more than scratching the surface. This drew traders to the area, Arabs first and later Portuguese, but also other Africans as migrants. The search for gold had in the end to be taken underground as the most easily available supplies ran out. Nonetheless, there was a rich enough supply to support a state lasting 4 centuries. It produced the only significant building in stone in southern Africa. There are relics of it in hundreds of places in modern Zimbabwe, but the most famous is at the place itself called by that name, which means only stone houses. From about 1400, this was a royal capital, the burial place of kings, and a sacred site for worship. So it remained until it was sacked in about 1830 by another African people. The Portuguese of the 16th century had already reported a great fortress built of dry stone masonry, and only in the 19th century have we records by Europeans of what we know to be the site. They were amazed to find massive walls and towers in carefully shaped stone laid in courses without mortar but with great accuracy. There was disinclination to believe that Africans could have produced anything so impressive. Some suggested the Phoenicians should have the credit, and a few romantics toyed with the idea that Zimbabwe had been put there by the masons of the Queen of Sheba. Today, remembering the world of other Iron Age peoples in Europe and the civilizations of of America, such hypotheses do seem necessary. The Zimbabwe ruins may reasonably be attributed to the Africans of the 15th century. Advanced as East Africa was, its peoples failed to achieve literacy for themselves. Like the early Europeans, they were to acquire it from other civilizations. Perhaps the absence of a need for careful records of land or of crops which could be stored is a part of the explanation. Whatever the reason, the absence of literacy was a handicap in acquiring and diffusing information and in consolidating government. It was also a cultural impoverishment. Africa would not have a native tradition of learned men from whom could come scientific and philosophic skill. On the other hand, the artistic capacity of Black Africa was far from negligible, as the achievement of Zimbabwe or the bronzes of Benin, which captivated later Europeans, show. Islam had been at work in Africa for nearly 800 years, and before that, there had been the influence of Egypt on its neighbors. By the time the Europeans arrived in America to discover other civilizations which had achieved much more than those of Africa and appeared to have done so without stimuli from the outside. This has seemed so improbable to some people that much time has been spent investigating and discussing the possibility that the elements of civilization were implanted in the Americas by trans Pacific voyagers a very long time ago. Most scholars find the evidence inconclusive. If there was such a contact in remote times, it had long since ceased. There is no unequivocal trace of connection between the Americas and any other continent between the time when the first Americans crossed the Bering Straits and the landings of Vikings. There is then none thereafter until the Spanish arrived at the end of the 15th century, to an even greater degree than Africa, and for a longer time, we must assume that the Americas had been cut off from the rest of the world. Their isolation accounts for the fact that even in the 19th century, pre agricultural peoples still survived in North America. On the eastern plains of the modern United States, there were Indians, as Europeans later came to call them, practicing agriculture before the arrival of Europeans. But further west, other communities were then still hunting and gathering. There, they would go on doing so, though with important changes of techniques. As first, the horse and metal brought by the Europeans, and then firearms were added to their technical equipment. Further, west still, there were peoples on the west coast who fished or collected their subsistence on the seashore, again in ways fixed since time immemorial. Far to the north, a tour de force of specialization enabled the Eskimos to live with great efficiency in an all but intolerable environment. This pattern survives in its essentials even today. Yet, although the Indian culture of North America are respectable achievements in their overcoming of environmental challenge, they are not civilization. For the American achievement in indigenous civilization, it is necessary to go south of the Rio Grande. Here were to be found a series of major civilizations linked by common dependence on the cultivation of maize and by possessing pantheons of nature gods, but strikingly different in other ways. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec foundation proved very important. The calendars, hieroglyphics, and the practice of building large ceremonial sites which mark so much of the region in later times may all be ultimately derived from it. The gods of Mesoamerica were already known in Olmec times too. Between the beginning and the 4th centuries of the Christian era, the successors of the Olmecs built the first great American city, Teotihuacan, in what is now Mexico. It was for 2 or 3 centuries a major trading center and probably of outstanding religious importance, for it contained a complex of pyramids and great public buildings. Mysteriously, it was destroyed in about the 7th century, possibly by one of a series of waves of invaders moving southwards into the valley of central Mexico. These movements began an age of migration and warfare which was to last until the coming of the Spaniards and produced several brilliant regional societies. The most remarkable were those from the Maya cultures of Yucatan, Guatemala, and northern Honduras. Their setting was extraordinary given its appearance today. Virtually all the great Maya sites lie in tropical rainforests, whose animals and insects, climate, and diseases demand great efforts if its resources are to be tapped by agriculture. Yet the Maya not only maintained huge populations for many centuries with rudimentary agricultural techniques, They had no plows or metal tools and depended on burning and clearing the land to use it for a couple of seasons, only before moving on, but also raised stone buildings comparable to those of ancient Egypt. Many Maya sites may remain undiscovered in the jungle, but enough have now been found to reconstruct an outline of Maya history and society, both of which have, in the last few decades, been shown to have been much more complex than was once thought. The earliest traces of Maya culture have been discerned in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. It blossomed into its greatest period between the 6th and 9th centuries AD, when its finest buildings, sculpture, and pottery were produced. Maya cities of that era contained great ceremonial complexes, combinations of temples, pyramids, tombs, and ritual courts, often covered with hieroglyphic writing, which has only in the last few decades begun to yield to investigation. Religion played an important part in the government of this culture, endorsing the dynastic rulers of the cities in ceremonies in which bloodshed and sacrifice played a signal part. There were also regular acts of intercession and worship in a cycle calculated from a calendar derived from astronomical observation. Many scholars have found this the only Maya achievement worthy of comparison with the buildings, and it was indeed a great feat of mathematics. Through the calendar, enough of Maya thinking can be grasped to make it evident that these people's religious leaders had an idea of time much vaster than that of any other civilization of which we have knowledge. They calculated an antiquity of hundreds of thousands of years. They may have been at the idea that time has no beginning. The stone hieroglyphs and 3 surviving books tell us something of this calendar and have provided a chronology for Maya dynasties. The Maya of the classical era used to put updated monuments every 20 years to record the passage of time. The last of them is dated to 928. By then, Maya civilization had reached its peak. For all the skill of its builders and craftsmen in jade and obsidian, it had considerable limitations. The makers of the great temples never achieved the arc, nor could they employ carts in their operations, for the Maya never discovered the wheel, while the religious world in whose shadows they lived was peopled by 2 headed dragons, jaguars, and grinning skulls. As for its political achievement, Maya society had long been based on patterns of alliances, tying together the cities in 2 dynastic agglomerations, whose history is set out in the hieroglyph of the monuments. At its greatest extent, the largest Maya city may have had as many as 40,000 inhabitants, with a dependent rural population about 10 times as big as that. This implies a destiny of population far greater than that of Maya America today. Maya civilization was therefore a very specialized achievement. Like the Egyptian, it required huge investment of labor in unproductive buildings. But the Egyptians had done much more. Perhaps Maya civilization was overloaded at an early date. Soon after its beginning, a people from the Valley of Mexico, probably Toltec, seized Chichen Itza, the greatest Maya site, and from this time the jungle centers of the south began to be abandoned. The invaders brought metal with them and also the Mexican practice of sacrificing prisoners of war. Their gods begin to appear in sculpture at the Maya sites. Seemingly, there was a contemporaneous cultural recession marked by cruder pottery and sculpture and a decline in the quality of the hieroglyph, too. By the beginning of the 11th century, the Maya political order had collapsed, though a few cities were to flicker back into life at a lower level of cultural and material existence during the next couple of centuries. Chichen Itza was finally abandoned in the 13th century, and the center of Maya culture shifted to another site, sacked in its turn, possibly after a peasant rising in about 1460. With that, Maya story goes into eclipse until our own day. In the 16th century, Yucatan passed into the hands of the Spanish, though only in 1699 did the last Maya stronghold fall to them.